I am Joseph. This is Input English. Today I have a fun episode. This is a collaboration with James of English Sponge. We have corresponded for months because we have much in common. We both produce comprehensible input on YouTube for people all over the world to improve their English. We decided to do a collaboration and we recorded this episode last week. James was kind enough to send the recording to me so that this could be hosted on both channels. So I hope you enjoy this discussion between James and myself regarding comprehensible input.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you, Joseph. Thank you for joining us today. How are you today?
Splendid, except I have to pick a fight because it's morning here. I'm in California.
Okay, yes, the time zones are different. So here in the UK, it's 5 p.m., and in California, it must be, I don't know, 11 a.m. Is that right?
Oh no, 9:01,
I, I
9 o'clock.
I wouldn't even be out of bed if I were you. Uh, so we're going to talk a little bit about languages and how we learn them. Actually, both of us learned Spanish. I suppose we're still in the process of learning Spanish, but I'm quite happy with my progress in Spanish. We have both not used traditional methods of learning. We've used comprehensible input methods, which is a different way of learning. Tell you what, Joseph, just tell us about your language learning journey. Let's hear about that with your Spanish.
Well, it actually started with a whole bunch of failure because when I was in high school, I signed up for classes in German and took 2 years of German and, passed the tests and did fine. But it was traditional methods. It was grammar, vocabulary, almost no input. So later, when I got a scholarship to study in Austria, I went to Austria and I couldn't buy groceries.
Hmm.
I couldn't function. Now, I could conjugate a verb. Let's say I was in a grocery store and the lady came up with a bowl full of verbs and threw them up in the air. I could conjugate them, but I couldn't tell her what I wanted to eat. So that was the failure that caused me to be really interested in better methods. Um, and I did years of Duolingo, which helps you with a little bit of vocabulary, but I realized that I wasn't going to get fluent in anything with Duolingo. So in 2023, I was on YouTube and I was, you know, putting questions into the search window, and I found I had this recollection of a word of art, comprehensible input. What's that? And that led me to Steve Kaufman of Link. And then Steve Kaufman led me to Pablo and led me to Stephen Krashen. And man, I was hooked. So I signed up with Dreaming Spanish in February of 23. And I admittedly got a little bit obsessed. So I didn't do 30 minutes a day. I did 3.5 hours a day. And obsession goes a long way if you want something.
So I just want to jump in there. So if
Sure.
you're watching this, Dreaming Spanish is basically a platform where you can, like English Sponge, like my platform, English Sponge, where you can basically watch lots and lots of content and lots of comprehensible input at your level. I have also used Dreaming Spanish, which was, of course, the inspiration for English Sponge. The idea of English Sponge is to be similar to Dreaming Spanish. It worked. Dreaming Spanish, I watched. I am not like you. I did not watch 3.5 hours a day. I'm not a crazy person. But I suppose on average, probably around 1 hour a day. I guess occasionally, maybe a 3 hour day. Sure. But I found that yes, like you, my Spanish improved very well. Do you know like, how many hours you've watched at this point? Do you have any idea how many hours of Spanish that you've listened to with comprehensible input?
Yes, because being a little bit compulsive, I'm going to keep track of that. So Dreaming Spanish, of course, has a time counter in their platform. So I know from logging on this morning that my time with Dreaming Spanish is 1,080 hours.
Fantastic. So you have, to make it clear, you have listened to 1,080 hours of Spanish comprehensible input, right?
No, no, no. That's just Dreaming Spanish.
I see.
And then Link, the app, allows you to play podcasts, and Link has a similar feature of keeping track of your time. So my Link tells me that I've got another 1,000 hours.
Okay, so we're on 2,000 hours of listening to comprehensible input in Spanish. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, I did not go back and study with a grammar text, but I do like to celebrate a human characteristic that is precious, and that is curiosity.
Mm.
And so if I was hearing something and I wanted to understand how it all fit together, I might take 10 minutes and look at a grammar and try to sort it out so that I could tell the difference between empathy and empathaba or whatever it is, whether it's the infinitive or whatever. So I didn't do much with grammar, but every now and then curiosity just overwhelms us, and you just have to take a peek.
Yeah, no, I think that is, in my opinion, that's a great way to do grammar. I think that personally, I think that grammar should be quite a very small percentage of your overall study. I think the way that people learn languages traditionally in school is not good. There's way too much focus on grammar and doing these grammar exercises with fill in the blank. You have to put the correct conjugation of the verb, or you have a multiple choice question and you need to, is it A, B, or C? No, this is not how a language is learned. I think, you don't have to study grammar a lot. I think what you should do is what you did, which is listen to lots of the language, listen to lots of comprehensible input. If you see a piece of grammar and you think, what's that? Then you can research that one thing if you're curious about it at the time. That's how you should learn grammar. And what happened to me is I started with more traditional methods. I started doing all kinds of kind of random things. I got a slow start in Spanish. I went on to Tandem, and it's an app. There's an app called Tandem where you can speak to people in another language. I messaged lots of people. I guess that wasn't so bad. Um, and I think I did a lot of reading in the beginning. I think I liked reading, which looking back is not ideal. It's not really the best thing to do at the beginning of learning a language. Although in Spanish, it's not too bad. In English, it would be a terrible idea to start by reading. That would be the worst thing you could do because your pronunciation, the effect it will have on your pronunciation is not good, right? By starting English by reading like loads and not listening, you're going to be mispronouncing all kinds of words. And in Spanish, because it is a phonetic language, it's not so bad because the words are pronounced as they are written on the page. Anyway, after about 8 months, I took a trip to Spain. And I was thinking pretty good about myself. I was like, well, I can speak a bit of Spanish now. I think I'm good. I'm going to try and speak to people in Spain. And I go to the supermarket, as we always say, and I buy my things, and the woman at the counter says, "Bueno, no, una bolsa," and I'm sorry, I just said "qué," which means what, huh,
Yeah.
in Spanish, and then she said it again, and I was like, I just stood there like an idiot. I'm like, I just don't know what's happening here. What? And really, to be honest, I should have guessed that she was asking if I wanted a bag, which is what she was asking. But I realized that I couldn't understand anybody. Now, I know this is normal, but I realized that really, I could not understand anything, not even anything anybody was saying. And I began to think, like, the way I've been learning, really, has this really been effective? Because I don't understand what anybody is saying. I can't understand a thing. So yeah, I started doing, I went onto YouTube and searched for Spanish listening, and I found some listening channels. I found a channel called Spanish Playground, which was a good start into comprehensible input. I didn't know it at the time, but it was comprehensible input. And eventually I found Dreaming Spanish like you. And I didn't really know what it was at first. I was just watching lots of Spanish videos. I didn't know what comprehensible input was, despite having been an English teacher for about 6 years. I had never heard of this method of learning. Um, so anyway, yeah, and I began to realize that simply through watching videos and watching lots and lots of videos, I was learning a lot of Spanish. And I began to realize that I can actually understand people now, and that was a big, let's say, a big thing for me because, for such a long time in Spanish, I just could not understand what anybody was saying. And with using Dreaming Spanish, with watching about 1 hour of Spanish a day using comprehensible input, I began to feel like I'm actually getting a grasp on the language. Like I can understand without subtitles what somebody is saying, which is a great stage to be at. And so,
When somebody says I've been studying for 4 years, that doesn't give us very much information. So in the United States, if you take a Spanish class in high school, that there are 180 school days per year. And if the teacher was talking nonstop in Spanish to you and you were paying attention, then in that 1 year, you would get 180 hours of input.
yeah,
But you know that the teacher's mostly talking in English. And so the amount of input that you get in a language class in the United States at the high school level is double digits. It's nothing. And so I could say, well, I had 2 years of high school German, and I had nothing, and that's literally true, but I probably only had 60 hours or 80 hours of input.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so I like what Pablo's taught us on Input English, which is don't talk to me about how many years you've studied,
definitely.
because the efficiency means that those years are meaningless. But talk to me about the number of hours that you were listening or watching a video and paying attention, and the video was at a level you could understand and you understood the story. Talk to me about that, and then we can talk.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's true that when people say I've been studying for 4 years or 6 years, it is meaningless because it's like, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe you've been studying 10 minutes a week for 6 years. That wouldn't actually be that much time. So when I first started learning Spanish, I was doing a lot of reading and I started saying the word espero, but I was always pronouncing it espero, like that. I would say espero que quiero. And it was like I had that habit of saying it wrong for about 2 years before I finally noticed that it's not espero, it's espero. Espero que. This is why you should start any new language by listening. Yes. You should start any new language by doing hundreds and hundreds of hours of listening. Because if you don't do that, if you try to read first, or if you try to speak from the beginning, it means that when you're speaking, you are sort of guessing like what the pronunciation is. You don't actually know because you haven't really heard it. You just know, okay, the word is spelt this way. I'm going to sort of guess how it's pronounced. And then you make all these guesses. Like in English, people might say something like, yesterday I walked to the shops, right? I walked to the shops. Or they will say even little things like they will say, something like 1 hour. I have been here for 1 hour, right? But and then this becomes their habit. This becomes their pronunciation habit for a long time. And then when they come to me as a teacher, they are saying things like, yesterday I walked to the shops and it took 1 hour. And I'm thinking, well, if you had started learning English by listening in the beginning, you would not have these pronunciation problems because you would know that it's not hour because you would have heard it like 10, probably the word hour, they probably would have heard it more than 100 times before they started speaking. So if you've heard the word hour more than 100 times, there's no way you're going to pronounce it wrong when you come to speak. You're going to know how to pronounce it. This is really important with English because English pronunciation is a mess. And think about stressed syllables. How do you know if it's like if you're supposed to say like let's take the word development, right? You see it written on the page and you try to say it as a beginner, you just sort of guess the pronunciation. You might say development, or you may say development. Whereas if you had listened for hundreds of hours before you started trying to speak, then you would know that the stress syllable comes on the second syllable and you say development and you would know it. It would feel correct to say that because you would have already heard it like 100 times. So, yeah, this is why comprehensible input is the way to start a language because that's one of the reasons because of pronunciation. Do you think so?
I do, but I don't want to trap my viewers
Mhm.
because they come in all varieties. And some people have done so much reading that I don't want to just say, well, you have to start with a silent period and you're not allowed to read
Yeah.
because they might get the message like, oh, I'm sunk because I've read 17 books.
Yeah.
So there are a boatload of false beginners in English. There are people who studied for 5 years in school and a lot of reading and traditional methods. And I want to be inclusive of those people. So I would qualify for my viewership that ideally, if you're starting from zero, you have a silent period. Now,
Yeah.
since I only make intermediate content, then I just take people as I find them. But you're absolutely right.
I mean, to be honest, it is the professionals who often have the biggest problems with this because people like doctors and people in professions, they often do a lot of reading in English. They can often read very well. They have a very high level of reading. But quite often when they speak, the pronunciation is all over the place because they have done so much reading that like I said, they are making guesses for how words are pronounced, right? Like I said, look, it's not the end of the world if you're already an intermediate student and you've done lots of reading and you're like, oh no, I did it wrong. No, 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 it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Ideally, you would have started with a silent period before speaking. But the thing is, it can be recovered, and you can still, it doesn't matter too much. Okay, you can still reach an advanced level of English. It's not, you don't have to quit now. No, 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 of course not. Yeah, you can still reach a C1 or even a C2 level of English. It's possible for anyone. But yeah, you may have to fix a few pronunciation issues that you may have picked up earlier on in your English studies.
But I had a researcher come visit my lab when I was a scientist. And he sent me a letter and came to visit the lab and spent a week with me. And he could read and write English, but he couldn't understand me. So I slowed down and gave him input. And we talked, but a lot of times if we got stymied, we would write it down and he would read it and say, oh,
Yeah, yeah, I guess his reading level is above his listening level.
which is so strange. But he told me, he said, I am really bad at hearing and I can't pronounce anything, and his pronunciations were very flawed
Yeah.
because it was all guesswork because English is a mess.
So obviously, a lot of people, right, they like to learn vocabulary by sort of trying to memorize the vocabulary, right? They may have like a list on a piece of paper, on a spreadsheet, maybe with 20 words that they want to learn that day. They want to learn 20 words each day. Or maybe they have flashcards where they have the word written on one side of the card and then maybe the translation into their own language on the other side, and they sort of look at one side, they think, okay, let me remember what it is. They turn it over, okay, what's the word again? And doing this kind of thing. What about comprehensible input? What is it better to learn vocabulary through comprehensible instead, or is there a place for memorizing vocabulary? What are your thoughts
I
on that?
think there's probably, I think there's probably almost no place for memorizing lists. So where I'm getting this is from the work of Marvin Brown and the ALG, that book that he wrote from the outside in. I'm getting it from Pablo Roman, but I'm also getting it from Robert Bjork at UCLA.
Mm,
And what Professor Bjork, who's in cognitive psychology, not language, but cognitive psychology, says that our memory and our ability to recall memory and use it is memory strength is related to the number of connections that the thing you're learning has with the rest of our experience. So if you memorize ball, pelota, you got one connection.
mm,
It's a very weak connection.
mm.
But if you hear it in context in a whole bunch of stories or read it in a book a whole bunch of times, then it's going to be connected to a whole bunch of different things. And according to Robert Bjork, the storage strength is going to be much stronger. And Pablo taught us that on Dreaming Spanish. So I don't do any explicit memory drills for memorizing vocabulary. I think there is a tool for building vocabulary that people can use big time, and that is reading.
Mhm.
If if I want to build the sound of the language, the rhythm of the language, the grammar of the language, I'm listening. I'm listening to native speakers and I'm listening a lot. But if I want to build a big vocabulary, I'm reading books.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, yes, obviously reading is great to learning vocabulary. I would personally leave that for a bit later and at least into your intermediate level. Maybe you could start reading at that point. Like I said, I wouldn't read at the beginning.
No,
You can learn the base, the core parts of a language through listening, yes. All the most common words, all the words, the daily words and everything. Really, you don't need to read books for that, right? You can
no.
hear that. It's really when you get to the more advanced level, there begins to be vocabulary that people just don't say very much. And then in which case, reading is great because you have lots of new words, lots of more advanced words in books and so on. But I don't think you need to read for the basic stuff like door and table and the simple verbs like go and see and so on. That really can all be done by listening for sure. So yeah, look, I love what you said about the having more connections like inside the brain when you learn vocabulary in context, right? I just think it's not really a good idea to learn vocabulary in an abstract way with no context, right? It's like it's not going to be a strong connection in your brain. The fact is, you can't memorize a language. You can't memorize the whole language. I mean, and when you're speaking, you can't be remembering. When you're talking, you don't remember words most of the time. It's not really your memory, which is helping you remember the words. Really, when you learn them, it needs to be on a subconscious level. They need to be stored in your head. so that when you talk, they just come out like this. And the cool thing about learning a language through comprehensible input is that I find that when I'm talking, these words just start coming out of my mouth. And I'm thinking, like, how do I know? Where did I learn that? I honestly can't remember why do I know this word? I have no idea where that came from, but I heard it somewhere. I've listened to so much Spanish that it's just in my head somewhere, and I can just start talking and they just start coming out. Something else that I've never understood when people say is I actually don't get it when people say that they say that they keep translating in their head, right? They say like I'm trying to speak and I keep translating from my first language to my target language. And the truth is I don't actually understand what they mean. I've never done this. I've never tried to translate from English to Spanish when I'm speaking. It just comes out in Spanish straight away. And I think it's probably because of the method that I've used, which is comprehensible input. I can imagine I think if you're speaking above the level you really are, if you're trying to speak about things that you have not listened to before, then the only thing you can do is try to translate from your first language into your new language because you haven't acquired the vocabulary you need to talk about this thing, this topic. And so the only option you have is to then just think, okay, let's go back to English and try to translate into Spanish.
I did that in German. When I was living in Austria, my level was so low that I literally did that. I would compose what I was trying to say and then try to do a word for word translation. And of course, that was rubbish. One of the things I noticed is that when you increment your input by 10 hours, there's no change that you can detect. But for me, when I added 300 hours to what I had, it was always breathtaking. It was always amazing to me. And I was cautioned by experts, don't don't worry about the process and don't overthink this, don't over evaluate it. But we're all curious people. We want progress.
Yeah.
And so I don't pay any attention to progress at the 10-hour cadence. I'm looking at progress at the 300-hour cadence. And then you can always tell the difference.
Yeah, it's true. You really notice it over a long period of time. After, yeah, like you said, 10 or 20 hours of listening to English, you may see not too much difference.
Yeah.
But see what happens after you've done 100 or 200 hours of English, and you will look back and think, wow, I really have progressed by doing this. You have a YouTube channel, Joseph. It's called Input English.
I
Um,
do.
maybe you can just tell us a bit. What is your channel about, and why did you make this channel?
My channel grew out of gratitude. When I started learning with Pablo and the group of content creators with Streaming Spanish, what struck me is all the work they put into that and how kind it was. It's a business, but how kind it was that they would make such a useful platform so that I could get this for a minimal cost. And so I looked around and I said, there's an opportunity for me to make a channel that provides a service. And so, much like you, I looked at the Dreaming Spanish experience and said, okay, how can I riff on this? How can I not knock it off as a copy, but how can I put my fingerprints on this and make some interesting content for a population and see if it flies? So I just created it out of gratitude and then the passion for learning language. And I can't teach somebody to speak German because I'm not an expert on German. but I can teach people how to speak English. But then I need to back up one step and point out that I am not an English teacher. I have no English teaching credentials. I'm a native speaker and an enthusiast and a language learner. And so that's what created my channel. And it's been really fun.
Well, I am an English teacher.
I know.
I have been an English teacher for around 7 years. But no, I would say that yes, the videos on your channel, they're great input for intermediate and upper intermediate learners of English. A lot, it's quite interesting stuff. I don't find myself, because I do watch some of your videos. Many of your videos are on my website, englishsponge.com. But I think they are interesting, and I can imagine that learners who are looking for a good intermediate and maybe slightly higher comprehensible input in English, I think it would be perfect for them. I can imagine that listening to your videos would be a kind of a fun way to get some more input in English. So for sure.
When people get to the intermediate level, they're trying to use native content. And maybe they can understand it, maybe not. But native content on YouTube or television series or movies is made for entertainment. And so when you and I make videos for comprehensible input, they are purpose built for comprehensible input. And so I don't have any knowing looks or chase scenes or explosions or arguments. Everything is language. And so I on your videos, on my videos, we try to create a very concentrated but still interesting delivery system so that people have a more efficient experience as opposed to watching a television series.
Definitely. The thing is, movies and TV shows are really not intermediate level things. I mean, personally, I would say you could start watching movies and TV shows maybe when you're roughly an upper intermediate level, B2 upper intermediate. I think at the intermediate level, these movies and TV shows are still a little bit too hard, in my opinion.
Correct.
And so videos like yours would be perfect. When you're using comprehensible input for English or any language, you should be watching content at your level. So what I mean by that is that when you watch the videos, you should be able to understand already at least like 80% of the video quite easily, right? And then there's an extra 20% that you maybe don't know, a few new words, a few new pieces of vocabulary that you can then learn easily. And you can learn them easily because you understand most of what is being said already. And that means that you understand the context of what the person is talking about. And that means the new words, they make sense. And so, yeah, if you're an intermediate learner, I think the Input English channel is a good place to go. I would save things like movies and TV shows for a little bit later, personally, a little bit later. They are very good, but later on, because at the intermediate level, it's still a little bit early. Even if you can understand a bit of what's going on, it's still not ideal. You should be able to understand, like I said, at least around 80%, roughly, maybe even higher than that. I think the
Right.
official one is more like 95% or something. I think that's what Pablo says, and he's probably right. I'm saying 80% just to be, whatever, be, yeah,
On that, you're being more inclusive because our viewers are in the real world
yeah,
and
yeah.
they're looking at real content and they have to make decisions. And if we demand that everything's 95% words then we've just eliminated a lot of content that they can actually use very well. The other thing Pablo did not really explicitly talk about is the power of repetition. So if I watch a video and I've got 80% of the words, and then I go back once a week or every 2 weeks and watch that video again, within a couple of months, I am now at 100%.
That's a very good point, actually. Yeah. I mean, it could be the case that if you watch the video the first time, you understand 80% of the words, and then the second time you understand 85%, and then the third time you understand 90%, and eventually you've learned a lot of vocabulary. Maybe even though the video is a little bit too hard for you, yes, that is a good way to do it. If I would say that perhaps for some people, repeating the same thing could be, perhaps for some people could be a little bit boring for some people to keep watching the same thing, which is why it can be good to have lots and lots of different videos, lots of comprehensible input. Thanks very much. It's been a great conversation.
I
We've
enjoyed it.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah, me too. Me too. I enjoyed it as well. We've talked about all kinds of things. It's getting a bit dark here, so it's probably about time to wrap up
Sure,
the
sure.
conversation. You can see it's the winter in the, well, it's not, it's the spring, the beginning of spring, but the sun goes down pretty early here in the UK. So it's now at the beginning of our conversation, it was light back here, and now the sun has gone down and it's pretty dark now. Thanks very much. Any last things to say?
No, no, I thank you for this opportunity. I enjoyed every minute of it, and I wish you and your viewership very good tidings. I invite comments below, and if you like videos like this, be sure to click on this one next. See you soon.